Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerechtbare Brüder in Amerika. Verkaufte Schabbos, es gibt
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is about the famous and renowned Kabbalist Rav Shalom Sharabi, the Rashash, and the yeshiva where he taught and ran, the Beit-El Kabbalistic Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. I do all kinds of Israel tours, history tours, walking tours in Israel. Next time you're here for a visit, you can be in touch with me about that. So probably the most popular one, and understandably so, is the Jewish quarter of the Old City. And a prominent stop in the Old City tours is the Beit-El Yeshiva building, which is right opposite the Churva Shul, which of course dominates the main square of the Jewish quarter. But the Beit-El Yeshiva has this storied history, and so if you want to hear more about it, then come when you come to Israel. I'll do the Old City tour for you, or any other tour that you want. Be in touch with me for tours, Yehuda at yehudageberer.com. In any event, so it's located right there off the main square, and it has this really cool door design. You really notice that it's a Kabbalistic yeshiva just from seeing the entrance to the yeshiva. Very, all kinds of symbolism and everything. And I was just, the last few tours that I've done, the last few weeks, I realized that it's a good and big and important story. The Rashash himself as a person and the Beit-El Yeshiva in its centuries of existence, that I might as well not just limit it to tours, but try to get the fuller story out in an installment on the podcast. Really two stories which overlap. The Rashash himself, Rav Shalom Sharabi, the great Kabbalist as a person, and the Beit-El Kabbalah Yeshiva as an institution throughout the 3 centuries, or the nearly 3 centuries of its existence. Now this Rashash is, and this I see on the tours, especially when I'm getting a more yeshivish group. So I always have to clarify that it's not the Litvak Rashash Reb Shmuel Strashun from Vilna, who lived 100 years later approximately, in the 1800s. This is the Yemenite Rashash, Rav Shalom Sharabi, who lived in Yemen and then Yerushalayim and lived in the 1700s. Okay, just to clarify that point. Now, what I noticed when I was studying the 18th century, that I noticed this curious phenomenon, and I was convinced that I was the first one to notice it, and I discovered that literally everyone noticed it before me, so I'm probably the last person in the world to have noticed this, that there's this flourishing of Kabbalah in the 18th century, each person independent of the other. In different geographical locations around the world. There's the Rashash, who's the subject of today, and he's in Yemen and later in Yerushalayim in the Beit-El Yeshiva as an institution of the study of Kabbalah. There's the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, Reb Chaim Ibn Attar, who most of his life is in Morocco. It's where his family's from. Later on, he's in Italy, and in the last few months of his life, he's in Yerushalayim also. There's the Ramchal, Reb Moshe Chaim Lutzato, who spends most of his life in Italy. Later, his last years is also in Amsterdam and other places. Travels a lot and has a hard life, actually. It's a good story. I think I did one of the first episodes of Jewish History Soundbites, but there's definitely a lot more to do on the Ramchal. And his last years of his life was in Akko, in Eretz Yisrael. And then there's the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, who lived in Ukraine, primarily in Mezhebish, his last decades of his life, but before that in other places in Ukraine. And of course, the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, Rabbi Eliyahu, the Gaon of Vilna, who lived in Vilna. Now, the last two did not live in Eretz Yisrael in the last years of their life, unlike the Rashash, who lived most of his life in Eretz Yisrael, or the Or HaChaim, who lived the last months of his life in Yerushalayim, or the Ramchal, who lived his last years in Akko. But the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon did not. But interestingly, they both attempted to move to Eretz Yisrael. So you have this interesting phenomenon. Now, all of them live in the 18th century. Pretty much all of them live at the same time. Now, obviously, they're not living exactly the same years, but they overlap. All of them overlap. The Vilna Gaon's the last of the five that I mentioned, so he's kind of a little bit after the others, but I guess his early years overlap with the first four. But all of them overlap. They pretty much live more or less at the same time, like I said, except for the Vilna Gaon, who's a drop later, but his early years overlap. And all of them are not just proficient in Kabbalah, they're masters of Kabbalah. They're pioneers in new Kabbalah thought. They have huge commentaries in Kabbalah and new pathways in Jewish mysticism and new ideas and elaborating on, obviously, they're all elaborating on the Arizal. Arizal is the great revelation of Kabbalah 200 years before that, in the 1500s. But it's fascinating that all of them live at the same time, pretty much, more or less, give or take, like I said. I don't want anyone to tell me, oh, he was a couple of years before or after. That's why I'm just clarifying that. And they all live at different parts of the world, and yet it's almost as if there's like this special hashgacha from Hashem that it's time for a new revelation of Kabbalah in the world, and here it is, and it comes in different places, different people, in completely different parts of the world. So I was pondering over this thing that I had thought that I was the one who discovered, and I found out that literally everyone else knows that already. And I was buying donuts for my kids the first day of Hanukkah a few days ago, and I bump into a good friend of mine who's a very, very rising star in the world of Kabbalah. I don't know, very huge Talmud Chacham and Tzaddik, Reb Joey Rosenfeld Shlita, and I bump into him, and I assume we start schmoozing, and he says to me, "So what podcast are you working on now?" I said, I think I'm going to do on the Rashash and the Beit-El Yeshiva. So I started discussing the subject matter with him, and I point out this thing that I noticed: this five great Mikubalim who lived at once in different parts of the world. And he says, oh, of course, everyone knows that. In the Kabbalah world, everyone talks about it. It's a huge thing. It's a huge idea. He focused on four of them. For some reason, he didn't include the Or HaChaim HaKadosh. He focused on the Rashash, the Ramchal, the Baal Shem Tov, and the Vilna Gaon. And each one is a different stream of Kabbalah. Different one is different approach in the Arizal's Kabbalah. And he even told me that it's Shmaya, something Siyata D'Shmaya or Brich Shmaya, Shin Mem Yud Aleph, which means the name of Hashem. So Shin is Rav Shalom Sharabi, Mem is Rav Moshe Chaim Lutzato, the Ramchal, Yud is Rav Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, and Aleph, Shmaya. Aleph is Reb Eliyahu, the Vilna Gaon. So it's the four approaches, and it corresponds. He even told me this. All obviously, I don't know. Reb Joey is a big Makubal, a big, tremendous expert in Kabbalah. So he told me that that it corresponds to Pardes of Kabbalah. In Kabbalah, in the Arizal's Kabbalah, there's Pardes, Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Said. And the Rashash, Rav Shalom Sharabi, is the Pshat of Kabbalah. His Kavanis of the Arizal is the Pshat of Kabbalah. And then the other ones are the Ramchal's Remez, and or maybe, I don't know, whatever. The other three are the Remez, Drush, and Said. I didn't follow the whole thing. The lights were... I was just, just amazing how you walk in the streets of Beit Shemesh, you're going to buy donuts for your kids for Hanukkah, and you end up meeting a Makubal who's a friend of yours who's telling you the secrets of Kabbalah that work well in the history that you're contemplating, and history and Kabbalah all comes together. It's unbelievable. Just walking in the streets of Beit Shemesh, buying donuts. Unbelievable. It's amazing things happen. So there's all kinds of stories associated with the Rashash. Some of them, I'll say, are more legends than stories. In other words, they haven't been verified. Some are demonstrably not true. I saw a few that I just laughed out loud when I saw them, so I'm not going to even say those. But there's other stories that are just legend, that maybe they are true, maybe they're not. I don't know. There's not great sources for them. But there's so much associated with the Rashash that they have to be said. He moved from Yemen when he was in his 20s. Maybe he was just even 20 years old or even younger. But he was quite young when he went from Yemen to Eretz Yisrael, a long journey, a long roundabout journey. We'll get to that soon. And the question is, why did he leave Yemen? Perhaps he was just striving for spiritual growth, the study of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. But the story goes that it was a result of a problematic confrontation with a Yemeni non-Jewish woman. One of the reasons I wanted to do this episode now is because my kids get woken up every night. Actually, today is Shabbos, it was this afternoon. Also, not just last night and the night before and the night before, from the Yemenite terrorists who are sending us these missiles. So I figured let's talk about the Kedusha that came from Yemen, the holy Makubal, the Rashash that came from Yemen, and that should be a tikkun, that we should be victorious over the Yemenite terrorists, and they should stop waking my kids up at night with their missiles. In any event, so this Yemeni non-Jewish woman was so. We'll take a step back. The Rashash's family was in the rug business. They sold rugs, hand-woven, special, expensive rugs, and they the Rashash, as a young teenager, would go selling the family rugs. It was helped out with the business to make a living for the family. And this Yemeni non-Jewish woman called him up and said, "I want to buy a rug. Show me your merchandise." And he spreads out the merchandise, and he notices that she closed the door. So he's alone with a woman, a married woman. He's not allowed to be. So he realized that he was trying to seduce him. So he jumped out the window, and he made a vow that if Hashem would save him, then he would go to the land of Israel, the Holy Land, and study Torah and engage in the study of Jewish mysticism, the secrets of Torah. And that's why he decided to leave Yemen. And his family supported his decision. They said, yeah, you were in a very challenging confrontation there, and you made this vow, and you have to fulfill it, so go ahead and live a holy life in the Holy Land. We support your decisions. That's the story why he moved. Now he came to Yerushalayim, and he joined the Beit-El Yeshiva, and the head of the Beit-El Yeshiva was a very great tzaddik, Reb Gedalia Chayun. He was actually the one who established this very, very important and special institution, the Beit-El Yeshiva, in the early 1700s. So Rabbi Gedalia Chayun, who was originally a Turkish Jew from Constantinople, today's Istanbul, but when it was the Ottoman Empire, which controlled the land of Israel at the time, so the capital of the empire was Constantinople, and Turkish Jews in general were the elite of the Sephardic world. They were the elite of Yerushalayim. They were the elite of the Ottoman Empire. Turkish Jews they very often called themselves Sfaradi Tahor. They very often would sign their names, Samach Tes, after their name, they would write Samach Tes, or I guess in the context of the Sephardic world, it would be Samach Tet, which stood for Sfaradi Tahor, a pure-blooded, kind of like a racist thing. They're pure-blooded Jews from Spain. In other words, they're very elitist. They were the financial elite in Yerushalayim, real estate, finance, banking. They were the rabbinical elite on the Sephardi rabbinical elite in the rabbinical courts and in the chief rabbinate, which was recognized by the Ottoman Turkish government, the chief rabbinate. The Turkish Jews were the elite of the Sephardic community throughout the Ottoman Empire, but especially in Turkey itself and in Eretz Yisrael and other places. They were the elite. So Rabbi Gedalia Chayun came from that community, and he moved to Yerushalayim. The story is told, again, this is one of the legends associated with it, that there was a drought in Yerushalayim, and rain was always an issue, and they didn't have a lot of natural water sources in Yerushalayim, so they stored the winter rains in water cisterns. So if you didn't have water in the winter from the rain, during the winter rains, during the rainy season, then there would be a drought during the summer, so it was always a very desperate situation. And the Jewish community of Yerushalayim came to Rabbi Gedalia Chayun, and the children were crying out to the rabbi, the tzaddik, Rabbi Gedalia Chayun. They were saying, Abba, Abba, give us rain. And he cries to Hashem, and he says, our Father in heaven, please provide rain for these innocent children that cannot differentiate between a father. They're calling me their father. They can't differentiate between the true Father in heaven, who is the one who can actually provide with rain, and me, who they think is their father. And they're looking to me and calling out Abba. And the story goes that as soon as he finished this special prayer, it started to rain. In any event, Rabbi Gedalia Chayun passed away in 1751. So the Rashash, his closest student and greatest student, was the great Makubal who succeeded him. He takes over the Beit-El Yeshiva in 1751 until his own passing in 1777, when he was about 56 or 57 years old. So the Rashash was the head of Beit-El for 26 years. Interesting that that's the name of Hashem. So the next legend that goes, and this is also a very famous legend associated with the Rashash, is that when he came to Beit-El, he hid his proficiency in Kabbalah, in his mastery of the secrets of Torah. And he told Rabbi Gedalia Chayun that he's just a new immigrant from Yemen, and he wants to be the custodian, the shamish, the janitor for the Beit-El Yeshiva. He would live in a kind of like in a side room of the Beit-El Yeshiva, and he would sweep and clean up and put away the Sfarim, and he would prepare hot drinks for the Kabbalists who came to do Tikkun Chatzais in the middle of the night and then studied Kabbalah for the rest of the night or during the day, and he would take care of them and make sure the whole place is in order. He would be the custodian of the institution. And secretly he would study Kabbalah and utilize all the great Kabbalistic works that were in the Beis Medrash in Beit-El, and it would be a secret, and that he was a great Kabbalist himself. So how was he outed? How was he exposed according to this story? So the story goes that one time Rabbi Gedalia Chayun was delivering his shir, and they got stuck on something in Reb Chaim Vital and the Eitz Chaim or Shari Kedusha, or whatever it was, and they said, okay, we'll resolve this tomorrow. Let's think about it. We'll sleep over it, and we'll resolve it tomorrow. And when everyone left the Beis Medrash and it was empty, so the Rashash, who knew the answer, so he wrote on a note, the answer and stuck it into the sefer that they had been studying. When they came the next day, they saw that miraculously there was a note written with the answer. So first they thought, oh, maybe it's Eliyahu Hanavi. But after this happened a few times, so they said, okay, it must be this custodian, this shamish, who's secretly a great Kabbalist, a master of Kabbalah. And he was confronted by Rabbi Gedalia Chayun himself, and the Rashash said, please keep it a secret. I just want to be left alone. And he said, no, time has come for you to reveal yourself. You're a great Kabbalist. You have to share your wisdom with the world. And eventually the Rashash is exposed and becomes part of the great Beit-El Yeshiva, and rises to the top very quickly, and he succeeds Rabbi Gedalia Chiyun when he passes away. Part of that legend is that he marries Rabbi Gedalia Chiyun's daughter. Now, that is probably not true. There's no evidence that he married Chana, the daughter of Rabbi Gedalia Chiyun. The Rashash definitely married and had children and descendants, many of them who were great Kabbalists themselves, and succeeded him in at least 4 descendants of the Rashash who were also the Roshei Yeshiva, the heads of Beit-El. His son, his grandson, and then another one who married his grandson's daughter, and then his son. So 4 direct descendants, or one of them was indirect, but 4 descendants of the Rashash were also great Kabbalists and succeeded him as the head of the Beit-El Yeshiva. So the Rashash definitely had a family and descendants till today, but it doesn't seem like he actually married Rabbi Gedalia Chiyun's daughter. In any event, another legend about the Rashash, well, part of it is not legend. He definitely would go down to the Kaisel, the Kotel, the Western Wall, and observe the custom of Tikkun Chatzais, which has a lot of it was a big thing in the Beit-El Yeshiva, was Tikkun Chatzais, mourning for the destruction of Jerusalem at midnight every night, and they did it at the Kaisel. And he blew the shofar. It was part of the ceremony of Tikkun Chatzais that he did every night. That seems to be that it was definitely done by the Rashash and the members of or at least the elite members of the Beit-El Chabura. The legend that's associated with it is that it disturbed the Arab neighbors, the crying and the prayers, and especially the shofar blowing. Imagine one of those big Yemenite shofars, and it's blown every night. It woke up the local Arabs and the neighbors, and it disturbed them, and they tried attacking him, the Rashash, and they got paralyzed. They were unable to attack him because he was such a holy Jew and Kabbalist that they were unable to approach and attack and physically attack him. And only when he prayed for them to get better and they realized he was a holy man, they left him alone and they stopped bothering him. That's a legend associated with the blowing the shofar at the Kaisel. There's another Kaisel legend that's associated with the Rashash. Also, I haven't been able to verify if it's actually true or not, but it's a very famous legend with the Rashash, so we can't not mention it, is that the Arabs, the local Arabs in the old city, they would throw their trash by the Kaisel as a disgrace to show the Jewish holy spot. We don't care, and just it was a terrible desecration of the Kaisel that the Arabs had the custom to do. They would throw their trash all over it. It was very challenging for the Jews to pray at the Kaisel because there was all this trash there. It was full of trash and it was smelly and stinky and got in the way, so they weren't able to daven there properly. So the story goes that the Rashash davened to Hashem, or another version of the story is that he himself placed coins, silver or gold coins, underneath the trash, and then he had the word spread throughout it sounds like a scene out of Family Guy. They had this word spread throughout the Arab community that there's gold and silver coins to be found underneath the trash by the Kaisel. So the only way to find these coins is if you clear away all the trash. So this way the Arabs cleared away all the trash, so there's no more garbage there, so that you solve problem one. Second problem is that because the trash all the garbage had accumulated for there, so they was still dirty and smelly. So then the Rashash again davened and that it should rain, and the rain washed away all the dirt and purified the air and it remained clean, and they lived happily ever after. In any event, those are some of the legends associated with the Rashash. Going back to his youth, he grew up in Yemen, and he was born in approximately 1720. We don't know exactly the year, but it seems that it was around 1720. Passed away in 1777. He was relatively young, but in Yerushalayim in that time, in the 18th century, that 56, 57 years old is considered, relatively average lifespan. So as a young youth in Yemen, he studied Torah and Kabbalah, as was the custom of Yemenite Jewry. Yemenite Jewry did not wait till you're an older scholar to study Kabbalah. Yemenite Jews, they studied Kabbalah as a young man. As a teenager, you're allowed to study Kabbalah. So as a young teenager, he was already quite proficient in the Kabbalistic mystical secrets of the Torah. And then he journeys to the land of Israel. Now, I found it fascinating as a historical tidbit about his route. He didn't travel. You'd think that you look at a map and you go from Yemen to Israel. So you go through Saudi Arabia and Jordan or Egypt or something like that and end up in Eretz Yisrael. But that's not how he went. And I'm wondering if that was a different way of going in those days. Maybe that was a trade route. Maybe that was more convenient. I have no idea. If anyone knows any information about this, I would love to know. I definitely have to do more research on this. But the route that the Rashash took was a very much roundabout route, and maybe that was normal in the 18th century. I have no idea. But he first crossed over that water, I don't know if it's the Indian Ocean or some other sea, to India, to Bombay, India. Today it's Mumbai, but in those days it was Bombay. And there was a Jewish community there then. He then goes north to Iraq. He's in Baghdad, in Iraq. He then goes east and south into Syria. First in Khalib, which is Aleppo, Syria, the famous old prestigious Jewish community there. And then Damascus, which also had a large and prestigious Jewish community at the time. And a couple of other places on the way. And he has interactions with the Jewish communities and the rabbis along the way. Remember, he's already a great scholar, including, very interesting, because the Rashash is known as a great Kabbalist, and here he has a halachic dispute regarding a kazayas, the size of the kazayas of matzah for Pesach, with a bunch of rabbis in Syria. Interesting. That's just a side note before he makes it to Eretz Yisrael. And he arrives and joins Beit-El. Beit-El was a relatively new yeshiva at the time. It was originally called Medrash Chasidim, and eventually later on it was called Beit-El, and it was headed and established by Rav Gedaliah, who he mentioned. And what did the old yeshiv community in Yerushalayim look like at this time? So it's interesting to note, this is the mid-1700s, 1740s approximately, and in the old yeshiva of Yerushalayim in the mid-1700s, there's basically no Ashkenazim. In fact, there was effectively a ban on Ashkenazim to live in Yerushalayim at this time. Several years earlier, in the year 1700, there was the Aliyas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, the immigration of this very interesting individual, probably a Sabbatian or something like that. It was a messianic type of immigration from Poland, that this Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid in the post-Shabtai Tzvi era, about approximately, give or take, 1,000 Jews, probably the largest attempted Jewish immigration since the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. They tried coming and settling down in Yerushalayim. Things didn't work out, and debts and typhus and all kinds of other terrible things, and they left. And because they left with all this debt, and it wasn't a clean ending to this story. We'll get to that another time, perhaps. It's also a great story. We'll delve into that another time. But effectively, the Ottoman government made a ban on European Jews from settling in Yerushalayim, which means Ashkenazi Jews. Jews from the Ottoman Empire were still permitted to live and stay and move to Yerushalayim, which means Sephardic Jews were allowed to live there. So the old yeshiv of Yerushalayim in the 1700s was basically completely Sephardic. Now, for hundreds of years, this was a established old yeshiv for centuries. It was Sephardic old yeshiv. And it's an undertold story, by the way. I think one day we'll have to go, I mean, we can't get it now. Now we're focusing on Beit-El, but in general, the Sephardic old yeshiv, it kind of starts, its early beginnings are from the Ramban's time. The Ramban moves to Yerushalayim in 1267 and reestablishes Jewish presence there. There had been no Jews living there since the Crusades who had killed all the Jews in Yerushalayim in the end of the last years of the 11th century, but nearly 200 years before that. But the Ramban reestablished a Jewish presence, and that, of course, is Sephardic, and that's very, very small. But following the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and especially with the Ottoman takeover of the land of Israel in the early 1500s in 1516, so that brings a large contingent, a large influx, a large immigration of Sephardic Jews to Yerushalayim and Sfas and Hebron and other cities in Eretz Yisrael. And the Sephardic old yeshiv becomes large and established and flourishes for centuries with some fascinating stories and communal life and economic life and rabbinical life and institutions and the Chalukah and all kinds of things. And it's a really undertold story. I think we should really get into that sometime. A lot of famous personalities. It's really, really interesting. But so it's completely Sephardic, and it's a very established old yeshiv. And Beit-El was actually, because it was a very rigid old yeshiv about the rabbinical establishment, and the economic elite controlled the institutions, and they controlled the fundraising apparatuses, and they controlled the Chalukah for the Torah scholars of Yerushalayim. So everything had to go through the communal control. And what's fascinating about Beit-El is that this great Kabbalist yeshiva was so recognized as an elite and special institution that it was the only institution in the Sephardic old yeshiv that was permitted by the governing authority, by the Jewish governing authorities, autonomous authorities, to have its own fundraising apparatus. So it's interesting that Beit-El was respected in such a way that it was outside the regular communal institutions, and it was allowed to do its own fundraising. So the Chabura of the Rashash, once he took over following the passing of Reb Gedalia Chayun at Beit-El, there was this elite Chabura within Beit-El. In other words, Beit-El was it was always small, because you're talking about Mekubalim, great mystical scholars, scholars of Jewish mysticism. It was a special elite. It wasn't young students. It was older married scholars, sometimes very old. It was middle-aged or even older. And there was always in the tens, like 30, 40 scholars at the most were students at Beit-El at any given time. But within this 30, 40 group, there was an elite group of scholars that were the special Mekubalim of Beit-El, and they were called Chevrat Ahavat Shalom. That's interesting today in Yerushalayim. There's also a Kabbalistic, there's also a regular Kailel and also a Kabbalah center of Chevrat Ahavat Shalom of Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, one of the greatest Mekubalim alive today. It's interesting that he must have taken this name from Beit-El. I didn't look into it, but I'm 100% sure that he did. It makes sense that he would. So the Rashash's Chabura included some of the greatest and most famous names of people who were living in Yerushalayim at that time. The Chida, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai, was one of the greatest Torah scholars and famous travelers, and he grew up in Yerushalayim and Hebron, Yerushalayim, and then later spent almost his entire life traveling around the Jewish world and settled in Italy and Livorno later on. Chida is someone who we never got to yet in Jewish History Soundbites, and we have to. I mean, he's such a great story. We'll have to get to him sometime. But he was part of this Chabura of in Beit-El at this time with the Rashash. He considered himself a student of the Rashash. The Ma'arit al-Ghazi, Rabbi Yontif al-Ghazi, who later succeeds the Rashash as the head of the Beit-El Yeshiva and as the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim from 1777 when the Rashash passed away. He's the head of Beit-El until his own passing in 1802. So before that, he's a student of the Rashash. He's a member of Beit-El, Reb Chaim de la Rosa, and one of the only Ashkenazim living in Yerushalayim at the time, Reb Gershon Kitover. Very famous personality, Reb Gershon Kitover, the brother-in-law of the Baal Shem Tov. Amazing person and a fascinating figure, and also something to speak about also, especially since Reb Gershon Kitover did one of the greatest services possible to historians. Reb Gershon Kitover maintained a correspondence with his great brother-in-law, the Baal Shem Tov, while he was living in Yerushalayim. And much of that correspondence has survived. Either letters of Reb Gershon Kitover or letters of the Baal Shem Tov. And even the letters of Reb Gershon Kitover reference other letters of the Baal Shem Tov which we don't have. And this correspondence is one of the only first-hand sources from the Baal Shem Tov himself, because most stuff that we know about the Baal Shem Tov come from secondary sources, either students of the Baal Shem Tov or students of students or things like that. And here we have letters of the Baal Shem Tov himself that he sent to Reb Gershon Kitover, and Reb Gershon Kitover sent to him. So we have these first-hand sources about the Baal Shem Tov. It's a side point about the Baal Shem Tov himself, but Reb Gershon Kitover lived in Yerushalayim kind of like secretly as an Ashkenazi, because he was one of the only Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim were not allowed to, so he lived as a closet Sephardi in Yerushalayim. And he is buried in the Sephardic section of the cemetery in Har Zeisim, which I do tours of also. We bring people to Reb Gershon Kitover's kever, among the many other tzaddikim and Har Zeisim tours. and he is part of this Kabbalistic yeshiva of Beit-El, and he's a student of the Rashash, even though he's older than the Rashash. It's a lot to say about his relationship with the Rashash and the Sephardic community, and his relationship with the Marit al-Ghazi, and his almost relationship with the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, which never happened because the Or HaChaim HaKadosh passed away shortly after he arrived in Yerushalayim, before Reb Gershon Kittiver had a chance to meet him, which is also a fascinating story about the Baal Shem Tov, but that we'll save for another time. So that is the... by the way, the Marit al-Ghazi is also a great story. Also worth spending. There's so many people from the Sephardic Old Yishuv. We have to get to the Sephardic Old Yishuv and get to that story as well. So that is the later years of the Rashash when he heads the Beit-El Yeshiva. Now it's interesting. Like Rabbi Gedalia Chayun before him, the Rashash also did. This was the custom of the heads of Beit-El. They led all the prayers. They were the chazan for all the prayers in Beit-El, which is very important. Why? Because the main thing that the Kabbalah of Beit-El provided that it did to the world in those early years, especially the Rashash himself, and this is what he's most known for, is the prayers with the Siddur HaRashash, the Kavanis HaRashash. That's all in the prayers. And it's according to the hidden meanings, the Kabbalistic mystical meanings of the prayers according to the Arizal. So the Rashash brings that out. And he does it by leading the prayers, and it's like a multi-volume manuscript that he uses, that he's turning pages the whole time, because there's so many different kavanas and intentions and all kinds of things that he has in mind, which are these special Kabbalistic meanings of the Arizal in the prayers. And that becomes one of the most distinguishing features of the Beit-El Yeshiva, at least in those early years. The Siddur with these Kavanis and had this tremendous impact on the study and practice of Kabbalah throughout the world. But that takes a long time because the Kavanis of the Rashash remain in manuscript form for many, many years. Initially, it was only in manuscript and it was only local. It was only in Yerushalayim. It only started to spread, still in manuscript, in the late 1700s and early 1800s. It starts to spread around the Kabbalistic world beyond Yerushalayim, but it's still in manuscript. It was only published as an official publication available for wider distribution in the early 1900s. In other words, well over 100 years after the Rashash's passing. So the Kavanas Rashash remain this special elite Kabbalistic secret for many, many years until they're available for the wider distribution. And today, of course, the Kavanas of the Rashash and the Rashash's Siddur is a major component and has a huge impact on the world of Jewish mysticism and its study in general. Beit-El was a very pioneering institution in the study, and it's probably the first yeshiva in the world that was completely devoted to the study of Kabbalah. And it becomes the elite yeshiva of the entire world where Kabbalah is studied. Later on, there were other yeshivas in Yerushalayim that opened as well that were dedicated exclusively to the study of Kabbalah. So there were many yeshivas that had both, that had a little bit of both. But I'm talking about exclusively devoted to the study of Kabbalah. Most of these yeshivas in Yerushalayim were Sephardic, but at least one was Ashkenazi, the Shar HaShemayim yeshiva. So there was Nahar Shalom, there was Rechovot HaNahar, there was HaChaim BaHaShalom, and the famous Ashkenazi one, which was established by Reb Chaim Leib Auerbach, the father of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, which was Shar HaShemayim, which is also, till today, a very prominent Kabbalistic yeshiva in Yerushalayim. It's interesting that all these Kabbalistic yeshivas were in Yerushalayim. We don't really have this phenomenon of Kabbalistic yeshivas opening up anywhere else in the 18th and 19th centuries, unless I'm mistaken. If someone else knows of others, then I would like to hear about it. But as far as I know, this is a strictly Yerushalayim phenomenon. It's very interesting. Now, later on, following the passing, it becomes the Rashash's yeshiva. It's known to posterity as the Beit-El Yeshiva of the Rashash, even though he didn't found it, but he becomes the most important personality associated with it. And four of the later Roshei Yeshiva of Beit-El were descendants of the Rashash himself, like I mentioned earlier. from the Sharabi family, and from the Gagin family. It was also others. I mentioned the Rabbi Yom Ghazi, Mert Al-Ghazi. There was also Rabbi Yedidia Rafal Abulafia from the famous and important Abulafia family, a few others, and then several successive generations, I think like 3 or 4 generations, of the prominent Hadaya rabbinical and Kabbalistic family, who were both rabbis in Yerushalayim and Kabbalistic heads of the Beit-El Yeshiva. In 1927, this is already during the British Mandate, but of course, the Jewish quarter is still the Jewish quarter is still populated by the Jewish community, and the Beit-El Yeshiva is still in its prominence. In 1927, there was this earthquake that weakened the structure of the yeshiva building, where it's today. And the British government ordered that the building be evacuated and reinforced. So they had to rebuild the building and evacuate it for a time period, but they returned shortly afterwards, and they were there until 1948. In 1948, the battle over the Jewish quarter in the Old City is lost by the Haganah, and the Arab Legion under the Jordanian commander Abdullah El-Tel defeats the Jewish defenders of the Jewish quarter in the Old City, and they surrender. And the Jewish population is led out to the western part of the city under Israeli control. And the Jordanians go ahead and they blow up all shuls, yeshivas, Jewish institutions of the Jewish quarter, because this is after the battle. This is not in the heat of battle. They want to show that the Jewish quarter, so to speak, is Judenrein. It's free of Jews. There's no more Jewish presence in the Jewish quarter. So the Chorva Shul is blown up, and the Nissen Beck Shul, Tferes Yisrael Shul is blown up, and this Rabbi Yechanan Metzakai Shul and all the other Sephardic shuls are blown up, dynamited by Abdullah El-Tel. And of course, the historic and important Beit-El Yeshiva, unfortunately, is blown up and destroyed as well. So there's this departure from the old city, and this destruction that the Jordanians did. But that's not the end of the story, because the Hadayas, Ovadia Hadaya, who was the Rosh Yeshiva at the time, he succeeded his father. He rebuilds the Beit-El Yeshiva on the other side of Yerushalayim, first in the Yegia Kapayim neighborhood, and then in Makar Baruch. And till today, it's on Rehov Rashi in Makar Baruch neighborhood, which is right near Geula, and that's where the main branch of Beit-El continues to flourish until today. But what's interesting is that after 1967, a couple of years later, the early 70s, Reb Meir Yehuda Getz, another Mekubal in Yerushalayim, seemingly independent of the other branch of Makar Baruch, goes back to the old city, because now, after the 1967-68 war, it was once again under Israeli control, goes back to the Jewish quarter, and reestablishes the old Beit-El Yeshiva at its original location in the Jewish quarter of the old city. So you have today, it is in both places, in Makar Baruch and Rehov Rashi, the main branch, and then the reestablished branch. Reb Meir Yehuda Getz already passed away a few years ago, so now someone else is the Rosh Yeshiva. I forgot his name, Rabbi Vichai, something or another. And it's still there. So when we go there, it's actually, when we go there on the tours in the old city, so not that many tours to Makar Baruch, but in the tours of the old city, it's not just the history that it once was, but there's still Mekubalim and Kabbalistic scholars studying in the Rashash's yeshiva till today. So it has this, the Beit-El Yeshiva, and the Rashash in particular, has this great influence on the larger Kabbalistic world, well beyond the walls of this storied institution. So this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.